Death, it's coming for you. Well, maybe just death as an all-new episode of The Point, that is. Stick around. Welcome back to The Point. I'm your host, Anna Kasparian, and on today's show, we're going to talk about something that scares the crap out of Sarah Palin. Not only are we going to discuss facts, something that makes Sarah Palin a little uncomfortable, but we're actually gonna have a death panel, something that she's been warning against for quite some time now. But what we're gonna discuss today is death in general. That's what the theme of today's show is. And we're gonna talk about different rituals and how they vary from one country to another. Then we're gonna talk about how to deal with death, especially if someone is terminally ill or if you're terminally ill. And then finally, we're gonna talk about the future of burials and cemeteries. What will the future look like with all of these advancements in technology? But before we get to all of that fun stuff, let's meet our wonderful panelists for today's show. Chris Ryan is a research psychologist who co-authored the New York Times bestseller Sex at Dawn. He also hosts the popular Tangentially Speaking podcast, and in the past has even guest hosted this show. Right now he's at work on his next book, which has a working title of Civilized to Death. Chris, thank you so much for coming back on the program.
No place I'd rather be.
All right, how's that book coming along?
Don't ask.
All right, okay. Caitlin Doughty is easily the most famous mortician on YouTube, where she hosts the popular Ask a Mortician web series. She is in fact a licensed funeral director working in Los Angeles. Caitlin also founded the Order of the Good Death website, and her work has been profiled on NPR, Huffington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Jezebel, Forbes, and Salon. Caitlin, I was watching your videos all morning, and they're incredible. They're very popular. Did you expect it to be as popular as it is?
I didn't. I initially just used YouTube as a hosting source for my videos, and I think people just are really hungry for good information about death, and I'm sort of it.
Right.
So, you know, it doesn't matter how great I am, it matters that the information is out there.
Definitely. And finally, John Alan Schwartz is the writer and director behind the legendary cult classic film Faces of Death. He has a lengthy Hollywood resume of writing, directing, and producing, and today he and his wife host their YouTube movie review series, Two Jews on Film. Tell me about that a little bit.
It's a lot of bagels and cream cheese.
All right, that sounds great. Well, let's go ahead and get to our very first point of the day, and of course it has to do with rituals, something that varies from one country to another. And unlike some Tibetans, we don't engage in Jador or sky burial, in which bodies are cut up into pieces and left on high flat rocks for vultures to pick apart. We don't starve and dehydrate ourselves for 2,000 days and then seal ourselves up in small stone rooms and wait to die the way self-mummifying Buddhist priests in Japan used to do. We also don't hang coffins of the dead on sides of mountains and cliff faces. And I'm pretty sure I've never participated in Famadihana, a funerary tradition of Madagascar where people dig up bodies of their ancestors from the family crypt, rewrap them in fresh cloth, and then dance with the corpses around the tomb to live music, which is fascinating. So
getting a second chance at show business.
Yeah, it's kind of amazing. And especially when you see those rituals compared to the rituals we do here in the United States. But Caitlin, some people would argue that some rituals are better than others, and or less creepy than others. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's kind of a slippery slope, because when you're thinking culturally, relativistically, everything's created equal. You know, the reason that we don't dance with our bones of our relatives when we die is because it's not something that we grew up with. And if it was a shifted cultural perspective, it would be very, very different. But frankly, around the world, the ritual or the body technology, disposal technology that's considered the weirdest is actually good old North American embalming, which is chemical preservation of the corpse, removing the blood from the circulatory system, putting in chemicals, and then doing other various sort of, I guess you could say, creepy things. And people really think it's bizarre around the world, the way that we shut ourselves off from death.
How did embalming become, you know, a Western thing? How did it first start?
It was actually a Civil War thing. The soldiers were going down to fight in the South, and they wanted the bodies to come back up north, and bodies start to turn very quickly after death. So it would be within a couple of days, they would try and put them on the train to bring them back to their families, and the conductors would be like, oh no, no decomposing decomposing corpses on my train. So they found a way to chemically preserve a body for a longer period of time. And then it really became about capitalism, because it became, okay, we can sell this corpse as a product. If we can make this corpse look nice and we can put makeup on it and we can preserve it, you know, here you go, family, give the body to us and we're going to turn it into a product of consumption, basically. And Americans, yeah, a morbid-free enterprise, and Americans love that. So we've been on that path ever since.
I can't wait to get to the capitalistic angle of it, because it's unbelievable how much you know, cemeteries cost, how much it costs just to put a body into a coffin. But before we get to that, Chris, what are your thoughts on what Caitlin said? Do you feel that all rituals are kind of created equal? I know that that's not exactly what you said, but it's kind of hard to judge one ritual as opposed to another, or do you think that some rituals are less creepy?
Yeah, I'm going to slip a little bit down that slippery slope, I think, because I do feel that there's something inherently creepy about rituals that deny the reality of death, and that the function of ritual is to make the incomprehensible comprehensible, or the intolerable tolerable, to give some sort of structure and meaning to something that we can agree on as a community that makes life a little easier and death a little easier. So I find the idea that, you know, as you described, I didn't know all this stuff about capitalism and selling the body, although I'm not surprised. You know, anything that can be sold is sold. But to me, that's creepy. You know, I'm as far as the Tibetan sky burial and the bodies and the Bo people in southern China and the different things around the world, as long as the ritual incorporates the reality of death, that's fine. But if it's the denial of death that's being ritualized, to me that's creepy and wrong.
There's also the ones that refuse to die. And what I mean by that is they want to become cryonically preserved, and for hundreds of thousands of dollars, people can get cryonically preserved, and there's no guarantee that if there's an electrical blowout and the generator doesn't take over, the body's just decomposed in the capsules. But this hooks back to what you were saying, is that there's tremendous fear and hope at the same time with death. The fear being, what the hell's going to happen to me, and the hope is maybe I'll go to a place that's better than this.
Yeah.
I think that's part of it, not understanding what happens after death. Now, of course, you have you know, religious groups that believe in heaven and hell, others that believe, you know, you just become the circle of life or part of the circle of life. But I guess I'm really fascinated with cryogenics, right? Because what do you guys think about that? Do you think that someday in the future there will be the possibility that we can bring people back from death? I mean, or is that just another example of Western culture wanting to deny the reality of death?
We can do it now. We do it now. If I've read of cases of people who fall through the ice, you know, into freezing cold water, and half an hour later, their heart starts again, and they live with very little nerve damage.
But the people that I was referring to, though, are people that have already been declared
clinically
deceased.
Dead. Yeah.
So what they're hoping for is that the future will hold their life force. You know.
Yeah, I saw a thing just recently on 60 Minutes where people are controlling an arm with their brain.
Yeah,
only
it's incredible.
I think that's where we're going. I think, you know, 200-300 years, we're going to be brains in machines.
Just gotta hope that the hand doesn't supersede the wish. You know, in other words, you're feeling bad talking to your hand one day, and all of a sudden it's like this.
The hand is tired of all the demands. It's going to rebel against you. Yeah,
it's a handoff.
There's a fair amount of hubris in cryogenics, too, and a fair amount of Western, you know, I don't know if everybody should come back, but I should come back.
Right.
I have the money, I have the privilege. You know, people are going to want to know what I have to say 300 years from now, and I would venture to say that those people are maybe not the people we want to hear from 300 years from now.
Capitalism meets death, you know?
Yeah. Isn't it interesting how there's so much fear of death, but nobody seems to be freaked out about where they were before they were born?
Yeah, it's because we like to live in the here and now. You know, we don't like to think about sad, somber things that could possibly happen in the future. I mean, especially in the United States, people love to live in denial. I mean, you see it when it comes to their finances, you see it when it comes to death. It's in all different aspects of life. But let's get back to the discussion of rituals, because I'm fascinated by this. You know, of course, rituals have to do with the notion that you want to respect the deceased, but what role do rituals play for family members that are mourning?
Yeah, well, I think as I said earlier, the function of ritual is to bring the community together in an agreed upon manifestation of meaning, right? So I do think there's a function of a ritual involving death where friends of the deceased all come together, people you haven't seen for a long time, sharing memories. But, you know, my name's Christopher Patrick Ryan, so I've got an Irish bias on this stuff, right? I love the idea of an Irish wake, where people get shit-faced and dance and laugh and tell great stories about the deceased, and end up having sex later, you know, even if it's drunken Irish sex, that's fine, because that's a celebration of life. And
is drunken Irish sex a little different from like drunken Mexican sex?
So we'll talk about it later.
Depends what's being served.
Go ahead, John.
No, I agree with you that the different rituals that people have, what it really allows people to do, it gives them a chance to assuage their guilt. Like during this lifetime, you were a great friend of mine, and I screwed you over or whatever. And now I'm back at your wake, you know, and I feel a release of my own guilt because number one, I made peace with you, but you got out before I did, you know.
Is that the reason why we have these open casket funerals? Which, by the way, I find that a little creepy. I mean, it's one thing to work in that industry and make the decision to handle or deal with dead bodies, but we have a ritual here that makes you face a dead body whether you like it or not. You know, it's a question of respect as well. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm just remembering when I was, I think, 8 years old, my grandmother died, and it was an open casket funeral, and everyone got in line and went up and kissed her corpse.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And I did it because everyone else was doing it, and that kind of freaked me out a little bit.
Most people, if they've seen a body in America, they've seen an embalmed body. And an embalmed body is very, very different from a regular old dead body, because an embalmed body has gone through a really intense chemical process. It usually has makeup on it. Usually they're trying to give it a lifelike appearance, but that sort of pretension of lifelike is what kind of makes it a little surreal. And so a lot of people say now, you know, I don't want that, just cremate me. Just, you know, my mother says, put me in a hefty bag and throw me out with the trash, because the idea is that I don't want this creepy wake. I don't want this creepy experience, and there's better ways to do it. So if you have a problem with your own death ritual, which I think is necessary and is important, you need to redefine it, and you need to come up with something that works for you. You can't just say, you know, oh, the embalming is creepy, just don't do it for me, whatever, and then just shut down, which is what most people do. It just, at that point, the discussion shuts down, and we just assume that we'll be cremated maybe, and we don't talk about it. And that leads to a shutdown of all sorts of other conversations as well.
It's funny. I had a friend of mine who's passed on, but his request was he wanted to be cremated, and then he wanted us to smoke his ashes and see what happened.
Like smoke, as in like tobacco smoke?
No, it's like you put papers together and dump some of the ashes in there, and you smoke it. I didn't do it.
Wow, that's fascinating. What was the purpose for that? Why was he?
It's just he wanted to go out. He wanted to go out and be remembered as somebody who was bringing light pleasure to other people.
I feel like that wouldn't be too pleasurable.
Yeah,
though I think he needs to rethink that.
Yeah,
and they're usually like fairly large chunks of bone in them as well. So unless you were doing some real sifting.
Thank God for my Cuisinart. That's
right.
all
Yeah. Well, yeah. You know, and you could probably make it work in some way, or at least the.
Well, it's just the thought. It really, whether it was ever executed, it wasn't during my time. But it was interesting to see somebody make a demand about their life after death.
I love the scene in The Big Lebowski with the ashes, where they go out to the Pacific and it all blows back. I thought that was a really nice sort of subversion of ritual, and you know, showing how death can be funny, right? Just like anything else.
I agree.
Because death is always funny in a way, because it's sort of life made ridiculous. You know,
it's always
like we can keep our control. Often I can sit here and, have some makeup on and do this, but once I'm dead, I'm decomposing, my body is doing all these things that I have no control over. And that's scary too for a lot of people.
It is scary, and I think that's part of the reason why we like to deny death. We don't want to believe that our existence is pretty irrelevant, you know, and we're just these tiny little particles that mean nothing when you really think about it.
We're rotting meat once we die.
God, this is depressing.
It is depressing.
It's not,
so let's talk about cremation. Let's lighten it up a
liberating.
little with cremation, okay?
Lightning it up.
Light it up.
All right, Caitlin, I watched a video that you did on cremation and how it wasn't really an acceptable form of, you know, do you consider it disposing
Disposition,
of
disposition. That's the kind of classy word for disposing a body.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about the history of that. It's really interesting that we went from being against it to being for it. So
right, well, there's a couple of reasons. It was considered very pagan when it first came to America, and it was very like sort of hippies and intellectuals and people who had this open mind about death who could accept it. But really two things happened in 1963. First of all, Jessica Mitford wrote a book called The American Way of Death, which basically exposed the sort of pickled, trussed up, embalmed corpse and let's look behind the scenes in the funeral industry. And that really got people, it was a huge bestseller, it got people talking. And then also the Catholic Church basically accepted cremation in 1963, and it wasn't before. So the Pope just kind of said, it's fine. You can't have the ashes, I think, at a ceremony or at a official Catholic mass, but other than that, it's okay. Go ahead, cremate yourself. And even then, it wasn't for a while, but it really has, and especially in the past 10 years, even has just exploded in popularity. And it's considered now, whether this is true or not, it's considered the conscious thing to do. It's considered the financially proper thing to do. But in a lot of ways, if you're just sending your body off to be cremated, that's a denial in its own way. You think you're being conscious, but if you just send the body away, I mean, a lot of what I've worked in direct cremation for years, and what direct cremation is you send the body off and you don't see it again. You get ashes maybe in the mail even. We can take the body, you can make a call in the middle of the night, we can go pick up the body, take it to our facility, perform the cremation, and mail you ashes via the U.S. Postal Service.
What do they charge for something like that?
Depends on how much ash you produce. So
I'm going to smoke it, so.
Right, yeah, so just a small amount for smoking.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time for the first segment, so let's take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to deal with death when you're confronted with it. So we'll talk about that and more on The Point. Welcome back to The Point. Whether we like to believe it or not, we're all going to die one day. And how do we deal with that? How do we confront death, and how do we deal with a loved one or family member who might be diagnosed with a terminal illness? Well, Dr. Charles Grob, a professor of psychiatry and biobehavioral scientist at UCLA, talks to us in this next point. Let's take a look.
My name is Charles Grob. I'm a professor of psychiatry and pediatrics at UCLA Medical Center. My point is, it is once again possible to conduct approved medical and psychiatric research with psychedelic substances. Some of the most exciting work done in recent years has been with individuals suffering from advanced cancer and overwhelming reactive anxiety. We conducted an FDA-approved study several years ago with 12 subjects with advanced terminal cancer and overwhelming anxiety utilizing psilocybin, one session as a treatment drug, and found, compared to a control treatment, significant alleviation of anxiety and improvement in mood. We also observed significant alleviation of demoralization and improved overall quality of life. While this treatment does not treat the cancer per se, it does seem to be a very valuable adjunctive treatment addressing much of the psychosocial stress and anxiety associated with this condition. Interestingly, it turns out that subjects who during the course of their one hallucinogen session have what is observed to be a powerful mystical or psycho-spiritual epiphany experience seem to have the best outcomes in regards to reduction in anxiety, improved mood, and overall improved quality of life.
Lots of great points made in that video, and just full disclosure, I have a family member who's been diagnosed with something very serious, and I have to confront the fact that that loved one is not going to be around forever. And there was a social worker that came in and talked to me, and they wanted to do counseling about death and how to deal with it. And Chris, what are your thoughts about that? Why is it that we're so afraid of confronting the inevitable in this country?
I think that one of the major flaws in Western civilization is an assumption that the here and now is all that there is, and any sense of transcendence is ridiculous. And I think that what Dr. Grob is putting his finger on with this research is that when people experience a sense of transcendence, which is possible through the use of psilocybin, through other sacred substances, sacred plants, also through meditation and spiritual practice of one sort or another, their anxiety is significantly lessened. And I think that this is something that we really need to think about. And it's not, what's interesting to me is that it's not anti-scientific. For example, there's a guy named Dr. Ian Stevenson, who's a psychiatrist at the University of Virginia, who for about 25 years has been studying reincarnation. And he's got graduate students all over the world interviewing families who have young children who recount stories of previous lives. And the grad students, particularly in India, Lebanon, and Brazil, and the United States. And they've found dozens of cases of children recounting these stories of, okay, I worked in a brick factory, and there was a river, and there was, this other thing, and whatever highway going through, and I was hit by a bus, whatever the details are. And they go and they actually find the town, and then they find the family and interview the family who knows nothing about this kid who's in another village on another part of the country. And they've identified more than 20 cases where they've identified the family of the deceased, and they confirm the details that the child's recounted.
So you're telling me that there's some legitimacy in the notion of reincarnation?
Yeah, yeah.
Wow.
If anyone wants to read about his work is extremely dry scientific graphs, and it's hard to get through because he doesn't want to be ridiculed. So it's very, very dry. But there's a book called Old Souls, which is written by a journalist who went to interview him and then decided, holy shit, I have to write a book about this guy. This is incredible. So there's a lot of scientific evidence. There's an arrogance in the sense that we know everything. Bullshit, we don't know everything. Nobody knows everything, including, the Pope and the Dalai Lama. Nobody knows everything, and so there is mystery around our rationality.
So maybe anybody knows nothing. Is that possible?
Now I'm confused. But confusion's a good place to be, yeah.
In other words, if you presuppose what death is and define it by your background and your life experience, who's to say? And then my perspective is the exact same one as yours, but we reach it from different levels. And I guess what I'm saying is that death is such an anomaly because we don't know where we're headed. And
right.
And even though we use religion as a guidepost, I mean, basically we have a long way to go before we can ever understand death.
But you're right, but I take comfort from the fact that when you look at the natural world, what you see are cycles. Yeah. You see conservation. For example, all the water on the planet has always been here. The water is not created and lost. It vaporizes and turns back into liquid and solid when it freezes. But all the water on the planet's always been here. It's passed through dinosaurs, it's passed through the ancient Greeks. We're all drinking each other's piss, I guess, in the final analysis. But in a more beautiful sense, I see life as the formation of a raindrop. Now the raindrop ceases to exist, but the water doesn't, right? So I don't see any real reason to think that life ends. It transforms, just like everything else that we see around
There's
us.
something very poetic about that, and also, I haven't read the work that you're talking about, but at the same time, just hearing that there's a possibility that you get reincarnated like that, it makes me feel a little bit better about the fact that one day I'm going to die. Because there is something very selfish about the way we do think of death. We don't want to believe that we're no longer going to exist, that we will cease to exist. Caitlin, tell me what your thoughts are on death, because as someone who has to literally deal with death on a regular basis as part of your career, how do you feel about your own death one day?
Oh, well, how long do we have? Well, I think that I've made a choice, and I think that this is a choice that everybody should make in confronting this and thinking about it as deeply as you have. I've made the choice that there is no after in this, and that I take incredible comfort in this. And I wouldn't define myself as an atheist necessarily, but at the same time, living a life on this earth, it's difficult. There are thoughts going through your mind all the time, and it's hard. And the idea of just having to continue that is pretty disheartening to me. I love the idea of sort of an old film reel flapping off the reel, and the screen just goes white and blank, and then there's just nothing. And yes, your body does an amazing cycle, and all the atoms in my body shoot back out into the universe and do a really incredible, create new life in that way. But my own specific brain somehow being hereafter is not comforting to me. It's actually the opposite of comforting.
That's interesting.
That's me. And I think that what everybody should do is just come up with that sort of thing for themselves. So every time they have a fear about death, they can go to that place and say, oh, right, this is how I feel about it. This is what brings me joy and comfort with thoughts of my own death.
Now, going back to what we were saying about cryogenics in the last segment, one thing that I forgot to comment on is the notion that, if they do figure out how to bring you back to life, and let's say it is 300 years from now, like, who wants to deal with that? I always tell myself, like, the best way to die is to make sure it happens before your husband or your loved one dies, right? Because I don't want to deal with his death. Like, I don't want to outlive him, And so imagine 300 years later, you don't know anyone. You're literally alone, and you're kind of like a freak of nature, because people are like, look at this guy.
And they've proven that they probably, even if it is, we're talking about like a disembodied brain or whatever it's going to be, you are going to probably be a little bit zombie-like, a little bit a freak of nature. There's going to be something, because it's not going to be a perfect process. It's not going to be like, and then I died and then I woke up.
It's a zombie.
Like, well, yawning and going like, what's going on here? It's probably going to be a pretty awful, weird, dystopian experience that you're probably not going to be very happy with. But at the same time, cultural relativism. If you want to be cryogenically frozen, God bless you. But
I love that Caitlin brought up that it's kind of a bit of a choice in terms of what you want to believe, what happens to you after you die. And John, I kind of want to get your insight on that as well. What do you believe? Do you think that it's just over, as Caitlin mentions, or do you
it changes? It's always in a constant state of evolution. There are days when you think you understand things in your life and everything's going hunky-dory, and then only to realize when you get home there's a terrible tragedy. So we live on this tightrope of uncertainty, and I think that to understand that means that you have to do this. You have to live your life, and when you're on your deathbed, be able to say, "If I only had," because that's the one thing you don't want to say. Don't regret life. Embrace life.
So what do you guys think about death being something that you get to choose for yourself? There was this story that went viral recently about two twin brothers in Belgium that wanted to be euthanized after they found out that they were going to lose their eyesight. Now, unfortunately, they were born deaf, so they couldn't hear anything. And then the thought of not being able to at least see one another caused them what they referred to as torture. They felt that it would be a torturous existence. And so after asking doctors multiple times to euthanize them, the doctors did give them a lethal injection, and they died. Chris, what are your thoughts on that story? It's been very controversial.
Yeah, I think this is the most important aspect of what we're talking about today, which is how our fear of death leads us to be cruel to one another. Living longer is not the same thing as taking longer to die, right? And I think we get confused with that. I think it's something like 1/3 of all medical expenditures are in the last 6 months of life or something like that. We spend a huge amount of money squeezing out those last minutes. And in most cases, the people who are experiencing that don't even necessarily want to be experiencing that.
They don't even know if they're not even conscious.
Or they're not even conscious, exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
You love your dog, you love your dog maybe more than you love certain people in your life, and when your dog is suffering, you have the right and the capacity to choose a merciful death for the dog. But if that's your mother, or your father, or your grandparent, or your husband, or your wife, I remember reading about a guy in Florida, 80 years old or something. He and his wife recorded a video. I think the wife had Alzheimer's. And they were very clear she wanted to die. She didn't want to do this anymore. They recorded the video to make sure everybody understood it. He shot her, I think, and he's in prison. The guy's in prison. It's just insane that we do this, and it's insane that we, you know.
I mean, think about how much we demonized, you know, Dr. Gregorian.
Oh, I know. I think he's a hero. I think he is a cultural hero.
Especially when he did that segment with Mike Wallace where he actually put somebody to sleep.
Right, because he was trying to force the culture to face the reality of this. And every time we turn away from it, more suffering is allowed to continue. It's cowardly. Home of the brave. I'm sorry. We need to man up a little bit. No offense to women, woman up.
Yeah.
I think people just don't understand how big of a problem it's going to be in the next, especially with the baby boomers getting older, and we're putting pacemakers in 92-year-old women and men.
Hip replacements.
Yeah, it's going to be.
And again, it's money.
It's money, but we're not going to have enough. We're not going to have enough resources to take care of people as they get older in this country if we don't have a better conversation about end of life.
Right.
Cancer is big money.
Yeah, quality of life. We have to focus on quality of life and stop worrying about death. And if we focus on quality of death, there's a saying, never count a man lucky until you've seen his death. And I think that's important. Like, dying well is worth thinking about. You know, die with some dignity, die intact. There's a lot of value in that. And I think our fear of death forces us to look away from it.
Our fear of death leads to torture of people who don't want to be here anymore, that want to you know, take advantage of what should be the ultimate freedom, and that's the freedom to choose when you get to exit this planet.
It's like live with courage, die with honor, you know?
All right, well, we're out of time for segment 2, but we do have one more segment left where we will talk about the future of death, so stick around. Welcome back to The Point. Our last and final point for this death-themed show is about the future of burials and cemeteries. And, you know, with the advancement of technology, are we going to see a huge change in the way we do these rituals? And to tell us a little more about that is John Troyer. He is from the University of Bath Center for Death and Society. And in the following TED Talk, he gives us a little more detail about what the future might look like.
There's a lot of answers I can give you about the future of cemeteries, and a lot of directions I can point you. But I think the one big breakthrough that's on our way, and the one that's going to be the most shocking to people, and I mean shocking in a way that we've already seen historically, is that cemeteries increasingly are going to begin using augmented reality and sort of mediated reality, depending on what term you use. By which I mean, you will be able to do something like this. Film a person, either a character playing the part of a tour guide or someone buried in a cemetery, or you before you die. Control that image, digitize that image, upload it, and then plant it on a network so that when you walk into the cemetery and either take a photo of just the space, so forget about a QR code, just take a photo of the space, suddenly that person is there talking to you. Now let's kick this up a step and talk about wearable computers. You walk into a cemetery with vision-enabled computing glasses and you see everyone in the cemetery. You get an entire history lesson across the board. That is the future of the cemetery. I guarantee it.
All right, another thing that I haven't really given much thought to, but it's really fascinating that technology might change the way that we do some of these rituals, and you know, our visits to the cemetery might be very, very different. John, what are your thoughts on some of the proposed technological advancements of cemeteries?
Well, I think we'll have like a Disneyland, except we'll call it Deadland, and where everybody can go see their relatives. And you know, but in all truth, there's so much video technology now is reaching a level where we will have holograms, and I think that, you know.
Do we want that?
It depends. I mean, when you're dead, you know, when your loved one dies, why prolong the pain by looking at a hologram? You know.
Definitely.
I mean, I think if anything, what this should teach us is this is a road we shouldn't go down, because this is another profit-making capitalistic move to make money off of people who are dying, and I take umbrage to that.
And another way of pretending they're not really dead.
That's right.
In a lot of societies around the world, when someone dies, you're prohibited from ever saying their name again. Right, which is what you're saying. Like, why prolong the pain? They're dead. It's over. You know.
I mean, I'm personally not interested in seeing like a sci-fi version of my family after they pass. It's something that I definitely think would prolong the pain. I wouldn't want to deal with it. But again, it does go back to this whole idea of not wanting to accept the fact that people do die. It's part of life, and it's something that we should learn to deal with, as opposed to something that we constantly deny. So, Caitlin, what are your thoughts?
Well, what's great about Dr. Troyer, who's actually a friend of mine, disclosure, is that he's one of the few people actually working on what's the future? What is the future? And we're so shut down about that. There should be engineers, there should be scientists, there should be artists, there should be people working on the future of our rituals and the future of our body disposition technology and the future of how we're looking at death. So regardless of how we feel about the holograms in the cemeteries, which I'm not sure I'm really that keen on as a sort of natural burial girl myself, but the idea that in academic circles and in higher circles we're talking about this, and death isn't some sort of like yuck, 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 you know, oh, the guy fell out of the coffin and wasn't that wacky, but it's a really higher level discussion about where we can go with technology and where we can go with what we have and how our culture is changing. That needs to be happening at really high levels right now, and it's not, unfortunately, and Dr. Troyer is one of the few people that's doing it.
Would you want a hologram of yourself after you pass?
No, I would like to be eaten by animals. I would like to be put in a field and torn apart by animals. So I would like the ritual and the remembrance of my physical form to happen in the days preceding that. So I would like my body to be laid out, and I'd like people to interact with it, but I'd like that image of me being dead to be the final image.
Are you going to be seasoned, or is it all natural?
Seasoned? No, all natural.
Okay.
Me, a corpse-looking corpsey.
Yeah,
ravens, turkey vultures.
There's a beautiful poem by Robinson Jeffers, who lived in Big Sur. And he writes about one day he's lying on this rock out over the Pacific Ocean in Big Sur, just lying there very still. And he notices a vulture start to circle above him. And he's lying there. He lies completely still until the vulture comes down very close to him. And then he moves and the vulture veers off.
That's a good memento mori, just watching the vulture circle.
And I remember the phrase he uses is he says, "I'm sorry, actually, that I'm not dead, because this is the way I would love my body to be recycled." He says, "What a life after death, what an enskyment." Beautiful phrase.
You know, we're talking about transportation post-life right now. And I think that one of the things that we have to look at, beside the technological advances so that we can be with our loved ones and prolong that, but what about taking a lot of that money and still redefine death and really go, because every day I still have yet to hear a theory or a philosophy that really rings true to me with what death is about. And I think that's just by sheer ignorance on the part of many different, shall I say, scientists who think they know it all. You know?
That's interesting. Can you elaborate on that a little?
Well, you have to come to my lab and know. No, actually, I think that we live in a world that there's a commonality that we have in the fact that we're going to have the same end, but yet there's a zillion different ends we could have. So as a scientist, you know, and a mathematician or whatever, you have to look at the numbers and figure out where can we intervene and try to prolong life.
So, quick question about a trip to the cemetery. Have you guys ever gone to a cemetery and looked at a gravestone and like really wondered about the life of a certain individual, Chris?
Yeah, I was tripping in college. I used to wander over to the cemetery quite a bit and think about the people. Yeah.
Are you being serious?
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's it. Okay. What made you think to do that?
You know, well, you're tripping in college, you wander over to the cemetery. It's just what you do. You
right.
know? Yeah.
You know, in Los Angeles, I'm sure there might be other cemeteries that do something like this. There's a event in the summer where people get together in the Hollywood Cemetery and they watch a movie at night. Have you guys heard of that?
Yeah.
Ah, a friend of mine's a comedian. He does shows at a cemetery here.
Yeah, it's right off of Wilshire Boulevard in Westwood. It's where Marilyn Monroe is buried and a whole bunch of celebrities.
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And well, Hollywood Forever does Dia de los Muertos too, which is a big, huge, gigantic celebration with altars and churro stands and music. And
I don't know. From my experiences, the one thing I find about cemeteries is that they're very peaceful.
Yes.
Right. Right.
And it's just it's a good place to just be retrospective. And
Yes, very much so.
Let's see how that goes during the zombie apocalypse, though.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, Kayla, I also saw your video on the zombie apocalypse. You're not a big fan of the zombies.
Not a big fan of the zombies because
Right.
I think it's a cultural death denial tool that we can sort of demonize the undead as opposed to being a decomposing body is very natural and part of the universe and what we should be doing when we die. But like, let's not turn it into this big horror. I mean, they're fun, sure, but it's also to make terrifying something that's not terrifying.
All right, Caitlin, go ahead, Chris.
No, I was just going to say, in terms of technology, just recently I had a strange experience. A friend of mine who I hadn't seen in years died, and one night I was on Facebook, and I searched him on Facebook, and there's his profile. Yeah. And I went in and sort of looked at his profile and his photos and stuff, and it was sort of a virtual funeral in a way, like a private funeral just for me or something. I'm not sure.
I experienced that as well. Actually, a very young girl around my age just recently passed away, and all of her social networking sites and all of that stuff is still up there.
Yeah.
And people will go there, they'll still tag her in pictures, they'll go to her page and they'll comment. And it's kind of like this weird virtual funeral or a virtual wake almost, right? Because you see images and everything.
Excuse me, but there are actual companies in the Midwest there's a company called Everlasting Memories, and they build a whole website around your loved one. Mm-hmm. So they put together pictures and poetry and anything. So it's sort of like what we were talking about.
Yeah, it's really interesting. And Caitlin, final question for you, because you work in this industry, so I'm wondering if you're seeing any changes in the way rituals are done, in the way people mourn their loved ones.
I think there is a tendency right now to sort of paint our nails while the house is burning down. Does that make sense? So to try and just throw some stuff on top of it. Like, did you know you could be turned into a diamond? Did you know that you could shoot your ashes into space? Which are all very interesting things and interesting advances, but we're getting too excited about really small things and really small, like, do you know there's more women than ever in the funeral? Well, yes, there are. There are more women in a lot of industries now, but it's like we're harping on those because we don't want to answer the bigger, more fundamental questions. So we're doing sort of chintzy new rituals as opposed to trying to fundamentally redefine or anything, or fundamentally go back and look at what we're doing and see if it's really the right thing for us emotionally.
So denial is really the ongoing theme when it comes to the topic of
denial
death.
is always the...
There's a book called The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, which is a classic.
Best book in
great
the world.
Book. And there's an entire realm of psychological research that came out of that book called terror management theory. And what they've found in dozens of very well-conducted studies is that when people are reminded of the presence of death, even on a subconscious level, they respond very differently. So for example, they have people walking down a street and they'll interview them before there's a funeral home down the street, but they can't see it. And they'll interview randomly chosen people about things like, what do you think the penalty should be for someone who comes to this country illegally, right? Sort of an innocuous crime, no victim, whatever. And they'll say, nothing, or 6 months, or expulsion, or whatever. And then they interview people after they've passed the funeral home. They don't mention death, but these people have just walked by a funeral home. So on some level, they've been reminded that death exists. And the answers are 5 years in prison. They're much more aggressive, aggressive toward people from outside of their group. So they're much more racist and against foreigners and things like that. It's very interesting how just the awareness of death freaks us out a little bit and makes us act differently in ways we don't understand.
But with the denial, there has to be some hope. And I think that hope will somehow give us the technology to understand those things that we can't comprehend. And I don't know how long it's going to take, but it leads to denial right now. But I believe that there's the next stage, and that next stage is hope.
All right, John. Well, you get the last word on this segment, and I want to thank you guys for joining us for this very unique discussion. It's not often you see an entire show dedicated to the topic of death. Chris Ryan, please tell our audience where they can find you and learn more about you.
I'm on Twitter at Chris Ryan PhD. You can check out our book at sexatdawn.com. You can hear me interviewing various interesting people, including your producer Malcolm, who's off camera over there, on Tangentially Speaking, my podcast, which is available on iTunes and at feralaudio.com.
All right, excellent. Caitlin, tell the audience where they can watch your awesome YouTube videos.
Other than the cemetery, they can orderofthegooddeath.com is the website, and just type in Ask Mortician on YouTube, and I'll be lurking there, waiting for you.
Excellent. And John, tell our audience where they can learn more about the projects you're working on.
Yeah, My Faces of Death is a book that's coming out, and you can get information on that by looking me up as John Alan Schwartz on Facebook. And also, I have a show on the internet with my wife called Two Jews on Film, which is, we not only review the latest films, but it also crosses over into our private lives. So,
oh, interesting. Okay.
So it's just a little unique kind of.
All right, great. Well, I certainly hope you guys thought that this show was to die for. I'm so cheesy. And of course, a special thank you to our Point contributors, Dr. John Troyer and Dr. Charles Grob. We'll see you next week with another episode of The Point.